An orphan boy with nowhere left to turn makes a heart-wrenching plea in a crowded courtroom. His eyes, brimming with tears, meet those of the judge, a man who holds the power to change his fate. "Please, can I come home with you?" he begs, his voice barely a whisper amidst the echoing walls of justice. What happens when the judge reaches out, not with a sentence, but with an offer of a home? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The oak-paneled courtroom felt too big and too small at the same time. Daniel perched on the hard wooden bench, his feet barely touching the floor. His navy blue sweater, carefully chosen that morning, now felt itchy and uncomfortable. Every sound echoed. The shuffle of papers, the quiet murmurs, the occasional cough. The prosecutor, Mrs. Chen, stood tall in her dark suit. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that on the night of March 15th, Mr. Sullivan's blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit when he crossed into oncoming traffic." Daniel's hands gripped the edge of the bench. He stared at his scuffed shoes, trying not to look at the man who had taken everything from him. But his eyes betrayed him, darting quickly to Michael Sullivan's slumped figure at the defense table. Officer Martinez took the stand first. "When we arrived at the scene," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "the defendant's vehicle had struck the victim's car head-on." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, but the officer's words painted pictures he couldn't escape. "Mr. Sullivan was stumbling, his speech slurred," Officer Martinez continued. "Empty beer cans were found in his vehicle." A sob broke the silence. It came from somewhere behind Daniel, maybe one of the spectators. He wrapped his arms around himself, making himself smaller. The next witness was Sarah Cooper, a nurse who had stopped to help. "I tried," she said, her voice cracking. But the impact was too severe. Daniel's chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing all the air out of him. Judge Franklin Morris watched from the bench, his kind eyes often drifting to Daniel. The judge's presence felt steady, like an anchor in a storm. When Daniel's breathing became too rapid during particularly difficult testimony, Judge Morris quietly signaled to the court officer, who brought the boy a cup of water. More witnesses came forward. Each story added another piece to the horrible puzzle of that night. The accident reconstructionist showed diagrams. The toxicologist explained blood alcohol levels. Through it all, Daniel sat, sometimes trembling, sometimes still as stone. Sullivan's attorney tried to paint it as a tragic accident, but the evidence kept mounting. Photos were shown. Daniel flinched at each one, though the worst ones were mercifully kept from his view. The afternoon light slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Judge Morris adjusted his glasses, looking down at his notes. The room fell silent, waiting. Daniel's heart pounded so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. "Before I deliver my judgment," Judge Morris began, his deep voice filling the courtroom, "I want to ensure that everyone understands the gravity of what we've heard today." The silence grew deeper. Daniel found himself holding his breath, his fingers twisting the hem of his sweater. Judge Morris's gaze swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on Sullivan before settling on the papers before him. "The evidence presented today has been both comprehensive and disturbing," Judge Morris continued. "We have heard testimony that paints a clear picture of the events that transpired on that tragic night." Daniel felt the weight of the moment press down on him. This was it. The moment when everything would change again, when someone would finally say out loud what happened to his mom, and Dad wasn't just bad luck or an accident. The room seemed to hold its breath with him as Judge Morris prepared to speak again. Judge Morris's fingers traced the edge of his papers, each word before him carrying the weight of lives forever changed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his bench, highlighting the deep lines of concentration on his face. He glanced at Daniel, noting how the boy's shoulders tensed with anticipation. "In the matter of the state versus Michael Sullivan," Judge Morris began, his voice firm and clear, "this court has carefully considered all evidence presented." He paused, removing his reading glasses. "Mr. Sullivan, please rise." Sullivan stood shakily, his attorney's hand on his elbow. The chains around his ankles clinked softly in the hushed courtroom. "Michael Sullivan, this court finds you guilty of driving under the influence resulting in death." Judge Morris's words rang out with quiet authority. The evidence clearly shows that your blood alcohol level was more than twice the legal limit when you made the decision to drive that night. That decision cost 2 innocent people their lives and left their child an orphan. A soft sob echoed from somewhere in the gallery. Daniel's hands gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. The maximum sentence for this crime is life imprisonment, Judge Morris continued. Given the severity of your actions and their devastating consequences, I hereby sentence you to life in prison. The prosecutor's shoulders relaxed visibly. Daniel's breath came out in a shuddering exhale. Across the room, Sullivan's head dropped, his attorney's hand now steadying him more firmly. Beyond the letter of the law, Judge Morris added, his tone softening slightly, I want to address the human cost of your actions. Young Daniel will grow up without his parents. No sentence I can impose will restore what he has lost. Tears streamed silently down Daniel's cheeks. In the gallery, several spectators wiped their eyes. Even the court reporter paused briefly to dab at her face with a tissue. Bailiff, please remove the defendant, Judge Morris ordered, his gaze following Sullivan as he was led away. The judge then looked at Daniel, seeing not just the brave face the boy tried to maintain, but the deep well of loss behind it. In that moment, the distance between the bench and the gallery seemed both vast and insignificant. The courtroom began to empty slowly, like a tide pulling back from shore. Whispered conversations and shuffling feet filled the air, but Judge Morris kept his eyes on Daniel, watching as the boy sat perfectly still amid the movement around him. The verdict had brought justice, but Morris knew all too well that justice couldn't heal all wounds. The last echoes of footsteps faded from the courtroom, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavy with emotion. Daniel remained seated on the hard wooden bench, his small frame seeming to shrink even further in the vast emptiness of the room. Judge Morris watched him from his position at the bench, noting how the boy's shoulders trembled slightly, his dark hair falling forward to shield his face from view. With deliberate movements, Judge Morris removed his black robe and draped it over his chair, the fabric rustling softly in the quiet chamber. He stepped down from the raised platform, his footsteps echoing softly as he approached Daniel. The boy didn't look up, his gaze fixed on his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. "May I sit with you, Daniel?" Judge Morris asked softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he reserved for moments like these. Daniel nodded without speaking, sliding over slightly to make room, the wooden bench creaking beneath him. The judge settled beside him, close enough to offer comfort but maintaining enough distance not to overwhelm the boy who had endured so much already. "You were very brave today," Judge Morris said, his voice gentle. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, not any of it." Daniel's lower lip quivered and he blinked rapidly against fresh tears. "I don't know what happens now," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the cavernous room. "Everyone keeps talking about foster homes and temporary placement, but—" He trailed off, his breath catching in his throat like a trapped butterfly. Judge Morris leaned forward slightly, trying to catch Daniel's eye, his weathered face full of compassion. "But what, son?" The word son seemed to break something loose in Daniel. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he finally looked up at Judge Morris, his eyes full of desperate hope and fear, glistening in the afternoon light streaming through the high windows. "Will you take me home?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Can I stay with you?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable, like a delicate thread connecting their hearts. Daniel's hands twisted in his lap as he added in a rush, "You're the only one who makes me feel safe anymore. Please, I promise I'll be good." Judge Morris felt his own eyes grow misty as he looked at the boy before him. This child who had lost everything but still found the courage to ask for what he needed. The depth of trust and desperation in Daniel's plea touched something deep in the judge's heart, awakening a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He found himself nodding slowly, tears gathering in his eyes as he recognized the magnitude of the decision forming in his mind. The usually composed judge had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "Daniel," he began, his voice thick with emotion. His hand moved to rest gently on the boy's shoulder, offering the comfort that words alone couldn't convey. feeling the slight tremors that ran through the child's small frame. Late that afternoon, across the Morris' front porch, Daniel stepped through the doorway, clutching his small backpack close to his chest. His eyes widened as he took in the warm, inviting interior of the house, so different from the cold courtroom he'd spent the past weeks in. The entryway opened into a cozy living room filled with comfortable furniture and family photos. Judge Morris placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder, guiding him forward. "Welcome home, Daniel." Before Daniel could respond, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked brown hair emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Eleanor Morris's face broke into a warm smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Daniel," she said softly, approaching him with open arms. "We're so happy to have you here." Daniel hesitated for just a moment before letting himself be enveloped in her embrace. Her hug was gentle and warm, reminding him of his mother's hugs in a way that made his heart ache and feel comforted at the same time. "Would you like to see your room?" Eleanor asked, stepping back but keeping one hand reassuringly on his arm. Daniel nodded, following the couple up a carpeted staircase. Judge Morris carried his second bag, the one containing what few possessions he'd managed to salvage from his old life. The bedroom was painted in soft blue tones with a wooden desk by the window and a comfortable-looking bed with a navy comforter. "We can change anything you don't like," Judge Morris said quickly. "Make it more your style." Daniel set his backpack down carefully and walked to the desk, running his fingers along its smooth surface. He pulled out a framed photo from his bag, one of him with his parents at the beach last summer. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the desk. Eleanor noticed his shaking hands and the tears gathering in his eyes. She moved closer, her voice gentle. "They'll always be with you, sweetheart. And we're here too, whenever you need us." Daniel pulled out a few more items, a well-worn baseball glove, some books, and another photo of his family. Each object seemed to carry the weight of his memories, but somehow placing them around the room made it feel a little more like somewhere he could belong. As evening settled in, the smell of home-cooked food wafted up from the kitchen. The three of them gathered around the dining room table where Eleanor had prepared a simple but comforting meal of chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Daniel sat quietly watching as Judge Morris said grace. The familiar ritual, though different from his own family's traditions, provided an unexpected comfort. As they began to pass the dishes around, Eleanor made sure to give Daniel an extra helping of mashed potatoes, having noticed his eyes light up slightly at the sight of them. Looking at his plate, then at these two people who had opened their home to him, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't happiness exactly. The grief was still too fresh for that. But perhaps it was hope. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he picked up his fork. Judge Morris and Eleanor exchanged a look across the table, their eyes reflecting both determination and compassion. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were committed to helping this wounded boy find his way back to joy. A few weeks later, Daniel trudged along the sidewalk, his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder as he made his way home from school. The autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet, but something felt off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He glanced back, trying to look casual about it. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just empty sidewalks and parked cars. Then movement caught his eye. Behind a large oak tree, a man in a dark jacket quickly stepped back into the shadows. Daniel's heart began to pound. He picked up his pace, clutching his backpack strap tighter. Another quick look confirmed his fears. The man had emerged from behind the tree and was following him, maintaining a steady distance of about half a block. The 12-year-old's steps grew faster, his sneakers hitting the pavement with increasing urgency. He could see the Morris' house now, just a few blocks away. The footsteps behind him quickened too. By the time Daniel reached the front door, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely get his key into the lock. He burst inside, slamming the door behind him and turning all three locks with trembling fingers. "Daniel?" Judge Morris called from his home office. "Is everything all right?" Daniel rushed to the office, his breath coming in short gasps. Judge Morris looked up from his desk, immediately concerned by the boy's pale face and frightened eyes. Someone was following me." Daniel managed to say between breaths. A man in a dark jacket. He was hiding behind trees and keeping his distance, but he followed me all the way from school. Judge Morris stood up, his expression growing serious. Tell me everything you remember about him, he said, guiding Daniel to sit in one of the leather chairs. He was tall, Daniel said, his breathing slowly steadying. Maybe 6 feet, wearing a black jacket and dark pants. I couldn't see his face very well because he kept hiding, but he had dark hair, and he knew what he was doing. He tried to stay out of sight, but I kept catching glimpses of him. Judge Morris listened intently, his brow furrowing with each detail. He moved to the window and carefully peered out through the curtains, scanning the street outside. You did exactly the right thing coming straight home and telling me, Judge Morris said, turning back to Daniel. He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. I promise you, we're going to take care of this. You're safe here. Daniel nodded, trying to believe those words as his heart gradually stopped racing. Judge Morris's steady presence helped calm his fears, but he couldn't shake the image of the mysterious man lurking in the shadows. Judge Morris closed his study door and settled into his well-worn leather chair, its familiar creases conforming to his frame as he picked up the phone. His fingers moved with practiced ease as he dialed a number he hadn't called in years, one that brought back memories of past cases and shared victories. Jack Warner speaking, came the gruff response after 2 rings, the voice carrying the weight of decades in the field. Jack, it's Franklin Morris. I need your expertise on a delicate matter. His hand tightened slightly around the receiver. There was a pause on the line filled with unspoken recognition. Judge Morris, been a while. What's the situation? Judge Morris leaned forward, his voice lowering to barely above a whisper. I have a 12-year-old boy in my care. Someone's following him and I need to know who and why. This isn't just teenage paranoia. The surveillance seems professional. I can feel it in my gut. Tell me everything, Jack said, his tone shifting from casual to focused, the change as sharp as a switch being flipped. Judge Morris detailed Daniel's experience, describing the mysterious follower and his tactics, his free hand gesturing unconsciously as he spoke. The man knows what he's doing, Jack. This isn't random. He's too careful, too methodical. I'll start first thing tomorrow morning, Jack replied, determination evident in his voice. Send me Daniel's schedule and a recent photo. I'll set up near the school and see what we're dealing with. The next morning, Jack Warner parked his weathered sedan where he could observe both the school entrance and the surrounding streets, a coffee thermos and surveillance equipment arranged neatly beside him. His experienced eyes scanned the area, noting every detail as students began arriving, their backpacks bouncing as they hurried through the morning chill. Around mid-morning, movement caught his attention. A man matching the description Judge Morris had provided appeared, positioning himself casually near a coffee shop across from the school. Jack raised his camera, its long lens capturing clear shots of the subject through the crisp morning air. The man's behavior confirmed Jack's suspicions. This was no amateur. The subject maintained excellent situational awareness, regularly changing positions and checking his surroundings with subtle head movements that most wouldn't notice. He seemed particularly interested in the school's schedule, taking notes about arrival and departure times in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Throughout the day, Jack documented the man's movements with meticulous precision. The subject followed a precise pattern, always maintaining a professional distance while gathering information about Daniel's routines. He noted when Daniel went to lunch, which entrance he used, and even which route he took to his different classes, all while appearing to be nothing more than another face in the crowd. By late afternoon, Jack had filled several pages in his notebook with observations, his cramped handwriting detailing every movement and pattern. The subject's methods were too refined for a common stalker. This was someone with training, someone who knew how to conduct surveillance without being detected, or would have gone undetected, if not for Daniel's keen awareness and growing sense of unease. From his parked position, Jack raised his binoculars, watching as the mysterious man took up position near the school gate, casually leaning against a newspaper stand. The man's posture, his methodical movements, the way he blended into the background while maintaining clear sightlines. Everything screamed professional operative, someone who had done this many times before. Jack lowered his binoculars and jotted down another note, his pen pressing firmly into the paper. This wasn't just a random interest in the boy. The level of dedication and expertise suggested something far more targeted. Something personal. Something that made his instincts, honed by years in the field, prickle with concern. Daniel stepped out of the school building, sharing a laugh with his friend Tommy about their science teacher's failed experiment. The afternoon sun felt warm on his face, but a sudden chill ran down his spine. The familiar prickle of being watched made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. There he was, the man who'd been following him. Only this time, he wasn't hiding. He walked straight toward Daniel with purpose in his stride, his eyes locked on the boy. Daniel froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. Tommy's voice faded into background noise as the man closed the distance between them. Just as the stranger reached out toward Daniel, a blur of movement caught them both by surprise. Jack Warner appeared as if from nowhere, positioning himself between Daniel and the man. "That's far enough," Jack said firmly, his stance protective. The man's face twisted with anger. He lunged forward, trying to shove past Jack. But Jack was ready, catching the man's arm and using his momentum against him. They grappled on the sidewalk, drawing gasps from nearby students and parents. Despite the man's rage-fueled strength, Jack's experience showed. He managed to pin the struggling man face down on the concrete, keeping him restrained with a firm hold. "Let me go," the man shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "That kid's family ruined everything. My brother's life is over because of that judge." Jack pressed harder as the man continued to struggle. "Thomas Sullivan," Jack said, recognition dawning in his voice. "Michael Sullivan's brother." Thomas spat words of hatred, his true intentions spilling out in his fury. "I was going to take the kid, make the judge pay ransom, let him feel what it's like to lose everything." His words dissolved into angry sobs. Students gathered at a safe distance, many with phones raised to record the scene. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his face pale but composed as he watched the man who'd been stalking him finally revealed. The wail of approaching sirens filled the air. Within minutes, police cars pulled up to the curb, lights flashing. Officers rushed forward to take control of the situation. As the police handcuffed Thomas Sullivan, Jack walked over to speak with them, explaining how he'd been hired to protect Daniel and detailing Sullivan's admission about the planned kidnapping. Daniel watched from 20 feet away, his hands trembling slightly as he hugged his backpack to his chest. He observed Thomas Sullivan being placed in the back of a police car, the man's angry shouts now muffled behind the closed door. Following this incident, Daniel's confidence was completely in shatters. He sat curled up on the Morris's plush living room couch, a soft blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly as he held the mug of hot cocoa Eleanor had made him. The marshmallows had long since melted, leaving swirls of white in the dark liquid that he barely noticed. "You're safe now, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, sitting beside him. She gently rubbed his back in slow, comforting circles. Judge Morris paced near the fireplace, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in hushed tones with the police department about additional security measures. Daniel caught fragments of words like restraining order and protective detail. The hot cocoa grew cold as the evening stretched on. When Daniel finally went to bed, exhaustion pulled at him, but sleep proved elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind filled with terrifying images. In his dreams, he was back in the car with his parents. The screeching of tires mixed with Thomas Sullivan's angry face pressing against the window. The crash that took his parents transformed into hands reaching for him, trying to drag him away. He thrashed in his sheets, his heart racing. "No!" Daniel cried out, sitting bolt upright in bed, his pajamas damp with sweat. Eleanor rushed into the room first, with Judge Morris close behind. She sat on the edge of his bed and pulled him close. "It's okay, Daniel. It was just a nightmare. You're safe here with us." Daniel buried his face in Eleanor's shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. Judge Morris stood in the doorway, watching with concern etched deep in his features. Later, after Daniel had calmed somewhat, Eleanor and Judge Morris spoke in hushed tones in the hallway. "He needs more help processing all of this," Eleanor whispered, wringing her hands. "The accident was traumatic enough, but now this? It's too much for any child to handle alone." Judge Morris nodded gravely. "I'll call Dr. Martinez tomorrow. She's the best child psychologist I know. and I'm having a security system installed first thing in the morning." A whimper from Daniel's room cut their conversation short. Eleanor hurried back in, finding Daniel tangled in his sheets, caught in another nightmare. She sat on the bed and gathered him into her arms, humming softly as she stroked his hair. "Shh, sweetheart, I'm right here," she murmured, rocking him gently. Judge Morris watched from the doorway, his jaw set with determination, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he witnessed Daniel's distress. The boy had already lost so much, and now this trauma threatened what little peace he'd found with them. The judge's face reflected both his worry for Daniel and his fierce resolve to protect him from any further harm. Daniel stared at his math worksheet, the numbers swimming before his eyes. The simple multiplication problems that usually came easily to him now seemed impossible to solve. His pencil hovered motionless above the paper, as his eyes darted repeatedly to the classroom window, checking for any sign of movement outside. Mrs. Peterson's voice faded into background noise as his mind replayed the terrifying moment when Thomas Sullivan had tried to grab him. His hands grew clammy, and he wiped them on his jeans, trying to stay present in the classroom. When the lunch bell rang, Daniel walked slowly to the cafeteria, his shoulders hunched. He sat at an empty table in the corner. His packed lunch, Eleanor's carefully made sandwich and fresh apple, remained untouched in front of him. 2 tables over, a group of students huddled together, their whispers carrying across the room. "Did you hear about the kidnapping?" one girl said in a hushed voice. "I heard they almost took..." another voice chimed in. Daniel's heart began to race. The sandwich in front of him became a blur as panic crept up his throat. He pushed the lunchbox away, his appetite completely gone. During recess, the playground buzzed with activity. Kids played tag, jumped rope, and kicked soccer balls around. Daniel stood at the edge of the basketball court, watching his friends play but unable to join them. Tommy, one of his closest friends, ran past and playfully tapped his shoulder. "Tag, you're it," Tommy called out. Daniel jumped backward with a startled yelp, his whole body tensing as if he'd been shocked. Tommy stopped and stared at him, confusion written across his face. "You okay, Daniel?" Tommy asked, taking a step closer. Daniel backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. I don't want to play," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. As the other kids continued their games, Daniel found a quiet spot near the school wall, wrapping his arms around his knees and watching the other children play. His teachers noticed. Mrs. Wilson whispered to Mr. Roberts, both of them casting concerned glances in Daniel's direction. Back in the classroom after recess, Daniel couldn't stop fidgeting in his seat. Every time someone walked past the classroom door, he flinched. Every sudden noise made him jump. The clock on the wall seemed to move impossibly slowly. As the other students packed up their bags at the end of the day, Mrs. Adler approached Daniel's desk. She knelt beside him, her kind eyes meeting his. "Daniel," she said softly, "is everything all right? You seem troubled today. Would you like to talk about anything?" Daniel shook his head, wrapping his arms tightly around himself. He turned away from his teacher's concerned gaze and stared out the window, feeling more alone than ever, despite being surrounded by people. The walls of the classroom seemed to close in around him, making him feel trapped and vulnerable. That evening, Judge Morris watched Daniel picking at his dinner, barely eating anything. The boy's shoulders were tense, and dark circles had formed under his eyes, making him look even younger and more vulnerable than his 12 years. The judge exchanged a worried glance with Eleanor across their oak dining table before clearing his throat softly. "Daniel," he said, keeping his voice gentle, "I think it might be helpful for you to talk to someone, a professional who can help you process everything that's happened." Daniel's fork clattered against his plate, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. "You mean like a shrink?" His voice trembled slightly, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. "The kids at school already whisper about me. If they find out I'm seeing a therapist..." He trailed off, staring down at his untouched meatloaf, his face flushing with embarrassment. Judge Morris leaned forward, folding his hands on the table, his wedding ring catching the light. "You know, after some of my toughest cases, especially ones involving children, I've talked to a counselor myself. He paused, making sure Daniel was listening, noting how the boy's shoulders relaxed slightly. There was this one case, about 5 years ago, that kept me up at night. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't focus on anything else. The counselor helped me understand my feelings and gave me tools to cope. Daniel looked up, surprise flickering across his face, his fork forgotten. You went to therapy? I did. The judge nodded, his expression open and honest. And it made me stronger, not weaker. Eleanor reached across the table and touched Daniel's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. You know who else went to therapy? Michael Jordan? Daniel's eyes widened, a spark of interest breaking through his troubled expression. Really? Yes. Eleanor smiled warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. He worked with a sports psychologist to become an even better player. And did you know that Lady Gaga speaks openly about how therapy helped her through tough times? Even Superman needs help sometimes. But Daniel hesitated, pushing his peas around his plate in small circles. What if I can't talk about everything? What if it's too hard? That's okay, Eleanor assured him, her voice soft but firm. A therapist is like a coach for your feelings. They're trained to help you go at your own pace, and everything you tell them stays private. It's like having your own secret keeper. Judge Morris added, Remember when you were learning to ride a bike? You didn't just hop on and race down the street. You started with training wheels, then gradually built up your confidence. Therapy works the same way, small steps, one at a time. Daniel sat quietly for a moment, considering their words. The kitchen was peaceful, filled with the warm glow of the overhead light and the comforting smell of Eleanor's cooking. The steady tick of the wall clock marked the passing seconds. Finally, he looked up at Judge Morris and gave a small nod. Okay, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll try it. Judge Morris reached over and squeezed Daniel's shoulder supportively, his eyes filled with pride at the boy's courage. The tension in the room seemed to lift, replaced by a gentle sense of hope. Daniel sat in the overstuffed armchair in Dr. Emily Hansen's office, squeezing a blue stress ball rhythmically. The room felt warm and inviting, with soft yellow walls and colorful artwork. Through the window, sunlight filtered in, casting gentle shadows on the carpet. How are you feeling today, Daniel? Dr. Hansen asked, her kind eyes watching him from her seat across the room. She had a gentle way about her that reminded him a little of Eleanor. Okay, I guess, he mumbled, focusing on the ball in his hands. Just tired of being scared all the time. Dr. Hansen nodded encouragingly. That's perfectly normal after everything you've been through. Would you like to talk about what scares you the most? Daniel squeezed the ball harder. I keep having these dreams about Mom and Dad, but they're different now, mixed up with the man who tried to grab me. He paused, his throat feeling tight. But there's something else, too. Take your time, Dr. Hansen said softly. We're in no rush here. Daniel took a deep breath. The night before the accident, I heard Mom and Dad arguing. They didn't know I was awake. His voice grew quieter. Dad was saying something about a flash drive. Mom wanted him to destroy it, but he said people needed to know the truth. Dr. Hansen leaned forward slightly. How did that make you feel, hearing them argue? Scared, Daniel admitted, his eyes filling with tears. They never fought like that before. Mom kept saying it wasn't safe, that they needed to protect me. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. I've never told anyone about this, not even Judge Morris. That must have been a heavy secret to carry all by yourself, Dr. Hansen observed. Daniel nodded, his shoulders slumping as if releasing a great weight. Sometimes I wonder if that flash drive had something to do with the accident, if it wasn't really an accident at all. Dr. Hansen's expression remained calm and supportive. Those are very big thoughts and feelings to deal with alone, Daniel. How do you feel now that you've shared this with me? Like I can breathe better, he said, realizing the stress ball had stopped moving in his hands, but also scared about what it might mean. We'll work through this together, Dr. Hansen assured him, her voice warm and steady. You're very brave for sharing this, and we'll take it one step at a time to help you understand and cope with everything you're feeling. As the session drew to a close, Daniel felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the secret had lifted a weight from his chest. Dr. Hansen gave him an encouraging smile as he stood up. "Remember, Daniel, you're not alone in this anymore," she said warmly. "We'll work together to understand what happened and help you heal." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a spark of hope as he left her office. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally find some answers. That evening, Daniel paced nervously in Judge Morris's study, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, occasionally tugging at a loose thread. The judge sat behind his massive oak desk, listening intently as Daniel recounted what he'd shared with Dr. Hansen, his weathered hands folded carefully in front of him. They were arguing about a flash drive, Daniel explained, his voice barely above a whisper, eyes fixed on the carpet's intricate pattern. "Dad said people needed to know the truth about something, but Mom was scared. I remember she kept saying it wasn't safe." Judge Morris leaned forward, his expression thoughtful, the desk lamp casting shadows across his concerned face. "This could be important, Daniel. Do you have any idea where they might have kept it? Even the smallest detail could help." "Most of their stuff is in boxes in the attic," Daniel said, finally looking up. "Maybe it's there? We never really went up there much, except to store things." The judge nodded decisively, pushing back from his desk. "Then that's where we'll look. Would you feel up to searching through some boxes with me? We can take breaks if it gets overwhelming." In the dusty attic, Judge Morris pulled the cord on a single light bulb, illuminating stacks of cardboard boxes and old furniture draped with white sheets. Daniel sneezed as they disturbed years of settled dust, the particles dancing in the dim light. "Mom was really organized," Daniel said, running his finger along box labels, a slight smile touching his lips at the memory. "She kept everything sorted by year and type. She always set a place for everything and everything in its place." They worked methodically, Judge Morris carefully lifting down boxes while Daniel searched through them, their movements stirring up memories along with the dust. Old photo albums, financial records, and forgotten electronics filled box after box, each item telling its own story of the past. As they searched, memories flooded back to Daniel. "That night, when they were arguing, Dad came up here," he said, looking around the dim space, his voice growing stronger with certainty. "I remember hearing his footsteps on the attic stairs. They were quick, like he was in a hurry." Judge Morris paused in his sorting, setting aside a heavy box. "Can you remember anything else about that night? Take your time." Daniel closed his eyes, concentrating hard. Dad had some papers in his hands when he came down. Tax papers, I think. He was holding them really tight, like they were important. "Tax papers?" Judge Morris repeated, scanning the labels on nearby boxes, his eyes narrowing with interest. "There." Daniel pointed to a box marked Tax Documents 2010-2015, tucked in a corner behind an old dresser. Together, they pulled the box forward, disturbing a cobweb in the process. Inside, beneath yellowed tax returns and faded receipts, sat a small metal lockbox, its surface scratched but still solid. Daniel's hand shook as he lifted it out, feeling its surprising weight. When he opened the lid, several USB drives lay nestled inside, their metal surfaces glinting in the dim light like buried treasure. Daniel looked up at Judge Morris, uncertainty written across his face as they contemplated which drive might contain his parents' secrets, each one potentially holding the key to understanding why they died. Daniel stared at the USB drives scattered across Judge Morris's desk when his phone buzzed in his pocket. An unknown number flashed across the screen. He glanced at Judge Morris, who nodded encouragingly. "Hello?" Daniel's voice wavered slightly as he answered. "Daniel, this is Richard Baxter." The man's voice was deep and slightly breathless. "I worked with your mother at Hamilton Technologies." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "You knew my mom?" "Yes, and what I'm about to tell you is very important." Richard paused, his breath heavy through the speaker. "Your parents' death, it wasn't an accident. Michael Sullivan didn't just happen to be drunk that night. He was paid to silence them." The room seemed to tilt. Daniel sank into the leather chair behind him, his legs suddenly weak. Judge Morris moved closer, concern etched on his face. What do you mean?" Daniel's voice cracked. "Your parents discovered something at Hamilton Tech, something big. They were going to expose it, but—" Richard's voice dropped lower. "Listen, this isn't something we should discuss over the phone. I have evidence, documents, recordings, things that will explain everything." Daniel's free hand found the metal lockbox, his fingers tracing its edges. "The flash drive," he whispered. "What was that?" "Nothing." Daniel looked up at Judge Morris, who had been watching intently. "Where do you want to meet?" "Tomorrow noon. The coffee shop on 4th Street. Been there. It's public, safe. Bring someone you trust." Richard's tone grew urgent. "But Daniel, be careful who you tell about this. The people behind this, they're still out there." Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. "I'll bring Judge Morris, he's my guardian now." "Judge Franklin Morris?" Richard seemed to consider this. "Yes, that's good. He has a reputation for integrity. Tomorrow then?" "Tomorrow," Daniel confirmed, his mouth dry. The call ended, and Daniel lowered the phone slowly. He met Judge Morris's concerned gaze, tears welling in his eyes as the full weight of Richard's words hit him. "He said," Daniel's voice caught, "he said my parents were murdered, that it wasn't just a drunk driver. Someone wanted them dead." Judge Morris placed a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We'll meet him tomorrow, together, and we'll get to the bottom of this." Daniel nodded, his eyes falling to the USB drives on the desk. What secrets did they hold? What had his parents discovered that was worth killing for? Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The next day, before they went to meet Richard, they headed to the bank in the morning to dig in whatever information they could gather. The bank's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow as Daniel and Judge Morris followed the security officer down a narrow hallway, lined with metal deposit boxes. The air felt cool and sterile, carrying that distinct metallic scent unique to bank vaults. Daniel's mother's box number was 2187. He remembered her mentioning it once during a family dinner, her voice casual but her eyes holding a hint of something more serious. "Here we are," the officer said, inserting his key with practiced efficiency. Judge Morris used the second key they'd found among Daniel's mother's belongings, tucked away in a small velvet pouch in her dresser drawer. The box slid out with a metallic scrape that echoed through the quiet hallway. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. Inside, he found several manila envelopes worn at the edges from handling, his parents' passports with their smiling photos, and some jewelry that brought back memories of his mother wearing them on special occasions. But what caught his eye was a small black flash drive labeled "Confidential" in his mother's neat, precise handwriting. "This is it," Daniel whispered, holding up the drive, feeling its weight in his palm. Judge Morris nodded gravely, carefully placing the other items back in the box with respectful movements. Back at home, they sat in Judge Morris's wood-paneled study, surrounded by law books and the comforting smell of old leather bindings. The judge's desktop computer hummed as he carefully plugged in the flash drive, both of them holding their breath. A window popped up immediately, requesting a password against a blue background. Daniel leaned forward, squinting at the screen, his reflection ghostly in the monitor's glow. "Wait, I think I remember something." He closed his eyes, recalling a conversation he'd overheard between his parents late one night when they thought he was asleep. They always used to say green means go when they talked about their work stuff. Mom said it was their special code. She'd say it like it was just a silly thing, but her voice always got different when she said it. Judge Morris typed "green means go" into the password field, his fingers moving deliberately over the keyboard. Nothing happened, the cursor just blinking steadily at them. "Try it with a 0 instead of an O," Daniel suggested, his heart racing so fast he could feel it in his throat. The screen flickered, pixels rearranging themselves, and suddenly multiple folders appeared, filling the monitor. Daniel and Judge Morris leaned in closer, their shoulders almost touching as they read the folder names. Project Greenlight, Toxic Reports, Bribery Logs. "Look at all this," Judge Morris murmured, his expression growing more serious with each folder they discovered. the lines around his mouth deepening. Daniel stared at the screen, his mother's words from that overheard conversation finally making sense, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. This was what they had been trying to protect. This was what they had died for. His fingers curled into fists on his lap as the weight of the discovery settled over him like a heavy blanket. That afternoon, Daniel and Judge Morris settled into a corner booth. They'd arrived 15 minutes early for their meeting with Richard Baxter, choosing seats that gave them a clear view of both entrances. Daniel fidgeted with his paper napkin, folding and unfolding it while Judge Morris kept his eyes trained on the door. "Remember," Judge Morris said quietly, "if anything feels wrong, we leave immediately." His tone was gentle but firm, the same voice he used in court when making important points. Daniel nodded, checking his phone for the 10th time. The cafe buzzed with the usual afternoon crowd, students with laptops, business people grabbing late lunches, and baristas calling out drink orders. The smell of coffee and freshly baked cookies filled the air, but Daniel's stomach was too knotted to think about food. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Judge Morris ordered 2 glasses of water, which sat untouched on their table, condensation beating on the outside. "Maybe he's just stuck in traffic," Daniel suggested, his voice tight with worry. But another 15 minutes ticked by with no sign of Richard. The buzz of Daniel's phone made him jump. A text message appeared on his screen from Richard's number. "I'm sorry, it's not safe." "Judge Morris, look." Daniel thrust the phone across the table, his hands shaking slightly. The judge read the message, his brow furrowing deeply. Without hesitation, Judge Morris pressed the call button on Richard's number. The phone went straight to voicemail, Richard's generic greeting offering no clues about his whereabouts or well-being. They tried 3 more times, each attempt meeting the same automated response. "Something's wrong," Judge Morris said, his voice low and controlled despite the concern evident in his eyes. "We should go." He placed a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder as they stood up from the booth. As they walked toward the exit, Daniel noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its engine running. The moment they stepped outside, the car's tires squealed against the pavement as it sped away, leaving only the acrid smell of burning rubber in its wake. Judge Morris's grip on Daniel's shoulder tightened protectively. "Come on," he said, steering them toward their own car. "Let's get out of here." Later in the afternoon, Daniel and Judge Morris returned home from the cafe. Daniel's footsteps faltered when he spotted a white envelope on the floor, just inside the door. "Look," Daniel pointed, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Morris picked up the envelope carefully, using a handkerchief from his pocket. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text that read, "Stop now or suffer the consequences." Daniel's hands trembled as he read the note. "What should we do?" Judge Morris guided Daniel to the kitchen table where they both sat down. The judge's face was serious but calm as he placed the threatening note in a clear plastic bag. "First, we document everything," he said, taking photos of the note with his phone. "Second, we need to decide our next steps." Daniel wrapped his arms around himself. "Maybe we should stop. I don't want anything to happen to you or Eleanor." Judge Morris leaned forward, his eyes kind but determined. "Daniel, what your parents discovered, it's bigger than just us now. The files we found show this corporation has hurt many families. If we don't stop them, more people will suffer." They spent the next hour making calls. Judge Morris contacted a security company to install additional cameras and motion sensors. He reached out to trusted colleagues from his years on the bench, retired judges, prosecutors, and investigators who could help build a strong case. "We're not in this alone," Judge Morris assured Daniel, as they sat reviewing the flash drive's contents. Spreadsheets and documents filled the screen, each one revealing another piece of corporate wrongdoing. Daniel nodded, his initial fear giving way to determination. He thought about other kids who might lose their parents if these people weren't stopped. His voice was steady when he spoke. "My parents would want us to keep going." Judge Morris squeezed Daniel's shoulder. "They would be proud of you." As the evening grew late, they organized the evidence into folders, creating backup copies and secure storage locations. The house felt safer with the new security system in place, cameras monitoring every approach to the property. Daniel looked at the threatening note one last time before Judge Morris sealed it away as evidence. Instead of fear, he felt something different now, a sense of purpose. His parents had died trying to expose the truth, and now he had a chance to finish what they started. The clock on Judge Morris's office wall ticked past midnight as Daniel and the judge hunched over the computer screen. Their tired eyes scanned through document after document from the decrypted files. "Wait," Daniel said suddenly, pointing at a folder labeled Family Records. "What's that one?" Judge Morris clicked on the folder and several documents appeared. As they began reading, both of their eyes widened. Daniel's hands gripped the edge of the desk. "My mother, she was..." Daniel's voice trailed off as he stared at the screen. The documents revealed an incredible truth. His mother, Sarah, wasn't just a regular employee at Maxwell Corporation. She was the hidden daughter of CEO Richard Maxwell himself. Letters, birth certificates, and private correspondence painted a clear picture of a family scandal carefully buried decades ago. "Look at these photos," Judge Morris said softly, opening an image file. The pictures showed a younger version of Daniel's mother standing beside a distinguished-looking man, Richard Maxwell. Their resemblance was striking, especially around the eyes and nose. Daniel touched the screen gently, tracing his mother's face. More documents revealed Sarah's persistent attempts to connect with her father. Email chains showed her reaching out, trying to establish a relationship while also pushing for ethical reforms within the company. Her messages were passionate but professional, always maintaining hope for both corporate change and family reconciliation. "She never told me," Daniel whispered, his voice catching. "All those times she mentioned her work at Maxwell Corp. She never said anything about being his daughter." Judge Morris scrolled through more files, revealing legal documents that proved Sarah's lineage beyond doubt. "Your mother was trying to protect you, Daniel, but she was also fighting for what was right, both as an employee and as Maxwell's daughter." Daniel sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. His hands shook slightly as he processed the truth about his heritage. All this time, he'd thought he was just the son of a middle management employee, but in reality, he was the grandson of one of the most powerful men in the business world. "I don't understand," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "Why didn't she ever tell me? And if I'm his grandson, why didn't he ever..." Judge Morris placed a steadying hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Sometimes adults make complicated choices thinking they're protecting the people they love. But you have every right to know your heritage, Daniel. You have every right to be part of that family." Daniel stared at a family photo of his mother as a young girl, standing awkwardly beside Richard Maxwell at what appeared to be a private company event. The distance between them in the photo seemed to tell its own story of separation and secrecy. "Your place in this family is real," Judge Morris assured him, "and so is your right to fight for justice, not just for your parents, but for your rightful inheritance." The next morning, as the sun streamed through the kitchen windows, Daniel sat at the breakfast table, pushing his scrambled eggs around his plate. Judge Morris watched him over the rim of his coffee cup, understanding the boy's distraction after last night's revelations. "Daniel," Judge Morris said gently, setting down his cup, "we need to talk about what this means for you." Daniel looked up, his fork pausing mid-motion. "About being Richard Maxwell's grandson? Yes, this inheritance. It's more than just money. It comes with responsibilities and unfortunately some dangers too." Eleanor placed fresh toast on the table, squeezing Daniel's shoulder before sitting down with them. The kitchen felt safe and warm, but Judge Morris's words hung heavy in the air. "I've scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Evelyn Clark," Judge Morris continued. "She's one of the best family lawyers I know, and more importantly, someone we can trust completely." Later that morning, they sat in Mrs. Clark's elegant office. Family photos and law degrees decorated the walls, and the leather chairs creaked as they settled in. Mrs. Clark, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, reviewed the documents they'd brought with focused attention. "This evidence is quite compelling," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "The DNA match alone would be significant, but combined with these documents and photographs..." She looked up at Daniel. You have a very strong claim to the Maxwell fortune. Daniel shifted in his chair. What do we do next? Mrs. Clark laid out several papers on her desk. First, we need to file for legal recognition of your status as Richard Maxwell's heir. Then we'll need to approach the board of directors strategically. She turned to Judge Morris. Given the circumstances of Daniel's parents' deaths, I strongly recommend increasing security measures immediately. I agree, Judge Morris nodded. We already have some measures in place after the recent incident. Mrs. Clark made detailed notes as they discussed various legal strategies. She explained how they would need to present Daniel's claim to the board, timing it carefully to prevent any attempted interference from other family members who might feel threatened by his existence. Your mother's documents show she was trying to expose corporate misconduct, Mrs. Clark observed, reviewing more files. That makes this situation even more delicate. We'll need to be very careful about how we proceed. Daniel listened intently, his hands clasped in his lap. Each word made his mother's secret life clearer, and with it the magnitude of what he was facing. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt a growing sense of purpose. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Clark handed them a thick folder of documents. Review these carefully. They outline everything we discussed today. And Daniel? She smiled warmly at him. Your mother would be proud of how you're handling this. Walking to their car, Judge Morris placed a protective hand on Daniel's shoulder. The boy walked straighter now, despite the weight of everything they'd learned. His mother's determination to fight for what was right lived on in him, and Judge Morris could see it growing stronger with each step. Judge Morris sat in his chambers, surrounded by towering stacks of law books and case files. His desk lamp cast a warm glow over the pages as he methodically searched through corporate legislation, looking for anything that could help their case. His reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he made careful notes. There has to be something here, he muttered, flipping through another dusty volume. Daniel sat quietly in the corner, doing his homework, but occasionally glancing up to watch the judge work. The steady sound of turning pages and scratching pen filled the room. Suddenly, Judge Morris straightened in his chair. Daniel, come look at this. Daniel moved to the judge's side as he pointed to a specific paragraph in the corporate charter. See this section on whistleblower protection? Judge Morris's finger traced the lines. And here, about wrongful death claims. Your mother was trying to expose corruption from within. According to these provisions, the company had a legal obligation to protect her. He pulled out the flash drive files they'd discovered, spreading out printed emails and financial documents across his desk. These records show a clear pattern of intimidation after your mother started gathering evidence, and look here. He pointed to a series of suspicious transactions. These payments were made to shell companies just days before the accident. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes widening as he saw his mother's name in several emails, along with veiled threats from senior executives. 2 legal aides joined them, helping to organize the mounting evidence into clear categories: financial misconduct, internal threats, proof of cover-ups, and the direct connection to the accident that killed Daniel's parents. This is more than just a simple civil suit, Judge Morris explained as they compiled the documents. We're going to show that your parents' deaths were deliberately orchestrated to silence your mother's investigation. The team worked through the afternoon, carefully preparing the lawsuit documents. Each piece of evidence was meticulously labeled and cross-referenced, building an ironclad case that couldn't be easily dismissed. Finally, Judge Morris stood at his desk with the completed filing in hand. Daniel watched as he signed the last page, making it official. The judge's signature was firm and deliberate, marking the start of their legal fight against the corporation. Daniel felt his heart racing as he watched, knowing this moment would change everything. Pride swelled in his chest, mixed with nervous energy about what would come next. His parents' fight for justice would finally see its day in court. The morning after filing the lawsuit, Judge Morris's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News vans lined the street outside his home, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, Daniel peered through the curtains, amazed at the crowd gathering on the lawn. This is bigger than we expected, Judge Morris said, watching the morning news coverage. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Judge files explosive lawsuit against corporate giant. Claims of murder and cover-up. Eleanor brought them both breakfast as they watched different news channels picking up the story. Each report seemed to add new details, piecing together the complex web of corporate corruption and tragedy. Judge Morris agreed to a carefully planned interview with a respected journalist. He sat in their living room, his posture straight and professional as he explained the case. "This isn't just about one family's tragedy," he stated firmly into the camera. "This is about corporate accountability and justice for all those who have been silenced." The interview aired that evening, and by the next morning the phones were ringing again, but this time with different callers. Other victims began reaching out, sharing their own stories of loss and corruption. "My husband worked in their chemical plant," one woman told them, her voice trembling. "He tried to report safety violations, and then suddenly there was an accident." Similar stories poured in. A former accountant who had discovered fraudulent records, a safety inspector who had been threatened. Each account added another piece to the puzzle, strengthening their case against the corporation. Daniel watched as Judge Morris and his legal team worked tirelessly, interviewing these new witnesses and adding their testimonies to the growing case file. The judge's dining room table disappeared under stacks of depositions and evidence folders. "Your parents would be proud," Judge Morris told Daniel one evening, as they reviewed another witness statement. "Their courage in standing up to this corporation has inspired others to come forward." The public response grew stronger each day. Social media buzzed with hashtags supporting their cause. Local businesses put up signs showing solidarity. The story had touched a nerve, and people were demanding answers. A week after filing the lawsuit, Daniel and Judge Morris stood at the courthouse steps. Below them, a sea of people had gathered, families holding photos of loved ones lost to corporate negligence, workers who had been silenced, community members demanding change. Their signs waved in the morning breeze: "Justice for Daniel's family. Corporate greed kills. Truth cannot be silenced." The crowd's energy was electric, their voices unified in support. Daniel felt overwhelmed by the sight of so many people who understood his pain and shared his fight for justice. Judge Morris placed a steady hand on his shoulder as they faced the gathered crowd together. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead in the underground parking garage, casting eerie shadows across the concrete pillars. Judge Morris stood near his car, his heart beating steadily as he waited. A figure emerged from behind a support column, moving cautiously toward him. "Judge Morris?" The voice was hushed, feminine. "I'm Sarah Jennings." She pulled a manila envelope from her coat and handed it to him. Inside were 3 external hard drives, carefully wrapped in anti-static bags. "Everything's here. 20 years of corporate cover-ups, illegal dumping operations, and falsified environmental reports." The judge carefully secured the drives in his briefcase. "Are you certain about coming forward, Ms. Jennings? The risks." "I've watched them poison communities for too long," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm despite her obvious fear. "I can't stay silent anymore." Back at his office, Judge Morris met with Marcus Chen, his trusted IT forensics specialist. They worked in a secure room, free from outside connections, methodically copying and analyzing the data. "This is unprecedented," Marcus muttered, his eyes scanning through document after document. "Look at these memos. Direct orders to dump chemical waste into water sources, followed by systematic cover-ups." The evidence was damning. Spreadsheets tracked illegal disposal operations across 5 states. Internal emails revealed executives joking about bribing inspectors. Environmental impact reports had been doctored, the real data buried under layers of corporate bureaucracy. Sarah Jennings sat with them later that afternoon, providing context for each document. "I was responsible for compiling the quarterly reports," she explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "They made us create 2 versions, the real numbers and the public version." She pointed to specific entries on the screen. "Here's where they ordered the disposal of toxic chemicals near residential areas. They knew the risks, but the CEO said proper disposal would impact shareholder value." Thunder rumbled outside as the storm approached. Marcus continued cataloging the evidence, creating secure backups and establishing the chain of custody for each piece of data. The legal team worked methodically, building an airtight case from Sarah's testimony and the digital evidence. These records prove intent, one of the attorneys noted, highlighting key passages. They knew exactly what they were doing and chose profit over people's lives. Rain pelted against the windows as Judge Morris reviewed the final compilation of evidence. Sarah's testimony had been recorded and notarized. The forensic analysis confirmed the authenticity of every document. They were ready. The massive courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Morris straightened his tie and took his place at the plaintiff's table. Every seat was filled, with reporters scribbling in notepads and members of the public craning their necks to see better. Daniel sat in the front row of the gallery, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sarah Jennings was the first to take the stand. Her voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom as she detailed years of corporate deception. "We maintained 2 sets of books," she explained, pointing to projected documents. "These showed the real toxic disposal numbers, and these," she gestured to another set, "were the falsified reports we gave to regulators." The corporate defense team's aggressive cross-examination only served to highlight Sarah's credibility. She remained steady, answering each question with precise detail and unwavering certainty. Marcus Chen followed, methodically walking the jury through the technical aspects of the recovered data. His testimony transformed complex digital forensics into clear, undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. The afternoon's testimony came from Gerald Maxwell, former vice president of operations, who had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. His hand shook as he described midnight dumping operations and payoffs to local officials. "The CEO was explicit," Maxwell testified, his voice rough with emotion. "He said anyone who spoke up would disappear. When Daniel's mother started asking questions about the environmental reports, Maxwell paused, glancing at Daniel. "He made it clear she needed to be stopped." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Judge Morris reached back and squeezed his shoulder gently. Throughout the day, the evidence mounted. Internal memos, email chains, bank transfers proving bribes. Each piece fit perfectly into the larger picture of corporate corruption that Daniel's mother had died trying to expose. As the judge called for the day's adjournment, the gallery hummed with conversation. Judge Morris gathered his notes, a quiet satisfaction in his movements. Daniel watched his face, seeing the careful optimism there as he reviewed the day's proceedings. Sarah Jennings caught Daniel's eye as she left the courtroom, giving him a small, encouraging smile. The truth his parents had fought for was finally coming to light. Following the hearing in the quiet of his office, Judge Morris studied the thick settlement document that had been delivered by courier. The corporation's legal team had finally blinked, extending an olive branch after weeks of damaging testimony. He adjusted his reading glasses, carefully reviewing each clause and condition. Daniel sat nearby, watching his guardian's face for any reaction. The office was silent except for the gentle rustling of papers and the tick of the old wall clock. "They're offering to make it right," Judge Morris finally said, looking up at Daniel. "Full compensation for all victims, including your parents' case, and they're committing billions to environmental cleanup." The settlement negotiations stretched across 3 intense days. Judge Morris, flanked by his legal team, methodically worked through each point. The corporate lawyers, their earlier arrogance replaced by pragmatism, agreed to sweeping reforms and oversight measures. On the morning of the announcement, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters and cameras. Judge Morris stood at the podium, his voice steady as he outlined the historic agreement. "Today marks a turning point," he declared, the microphones carrying his words to the gathered crowd. "The settlement includes a $5 billion fund for environmental restoration, full compensation for affected families, and mandatory independent oversight of all corporate operations." Daniel watched from the side, his heart swelling with pride. As Judge Morris detailed the medical monitoring program for affected communities and the new whistleblower protections, tears formed in Daniel's eyes. This was what his parents had fought for. The crowd erupted in cheers as Judge Morris concluded the announcement. Victims hugged each other, some crying with relief. Environmental activists unfurled banners celebrating the victory, News reporters rushed to get reactions from the assembled crowd. In a quiet moment away from the cameras, Judge Morris found Daniel near the courthouse doors. They stood together, watching the celebration unfold. No words were needed as Judge Morris placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder, both understanding the magnitude of what they had achieved. The settlement papers lay signed and sealed in Judge Morris's briefcase, representing not just justice for Daniel's parents, but hope for countless others affected by corporate greed. The celebration continued around them, a testament to the power of truth and persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The morning newspapers splashed explosive headlines across their front pages. "Corporate corruption reaches Capitol Hill," screamed the Washington Post. "Government officials named in environmental cover-up," declared the New York Times. Daniel sat at the breakfast table, spreading the papers out while Judge Morris sipped his coffee, both absorbing the shocking revelations. Investigative journalists had uncovered a web of connections between senior government officials and the corporation. Email trails, offshore accounts, and secret meetings painted a damning picture of regulatory capture and deliberate negligence. 3 cabinet members implicated, Judge Morris noted, his finger tracing the list of names, and dozens of lower-level officials who looked the other way. Within hours, press conferences began. The first resignation came from the Environmental Protection Agency's director, followed quickly by 2 deputy secretaries. Their prepared statements rang hollow as they offered carefully worded apologies without admitting specific wrongdoing. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, demanding accountability. Social media exploded with calls for reform and justice. The pressure mounted until the president himself announced a special commission to investigate regulatory failures. A week later, Judge Morris stood before Congress, his testimony broadcast live across major networks. Daniel sat in the gallery, watching his guardian address the packed chamber with characteristic precision and authority. "The system didn't just fail," Judge Morris declared, his voice firm. "It was deliberately undermined by those tasked with protecting it. We need more than just new regulations. We need a complete overhaul of how we monitor and enforce corporate compliance." He laid out a comprehensive proposal: independent oversight boards, enhanced whistleblower protections, and mandatory environmental impact reviews with real teeth. The legislators leaned forward in their seats, many taking notes as Judge Morris detailed specific legislative changes needed to prevent future corporate malfeasance. Questions from committee members followed, some supportive, others defensive. Judge Morris handled each with measured responses, backed by evidence from the recent case. Daniel watched with pride as his guardian masterfully navigated the political landscape while keeping the focus on substantive reform. That evening, Daniel sat in the living room of their home, watching the news coverage of the day's events. The anchor's voice was solemn as she declared it a watershed moment for environmental justice in America. Images flashed across the screen: the congressional hearing, protesters with signs, resigned officials leaving their offices, and finally, a photo of Daniel's parents at an environmental rally years ago. Daniel felt tears well up in his eyes, a complex mixture of grief and satisfaction washing over him. His parents' fight hadn't been in vain. Their legacy lived on in the changes sweeping through the halls of power, and in the new protections being crafted to prevent future corporate abuse. Judge Morris sat down beside him, both watching as the news anchor detailed the scope of the unfolding reform movement. The story of Daniel's parents had become a catalyst for change, their sacrifice illuminating the path toward genuine corporate accountability and environmental protection. The morning news cycle exploded with revelations that shook the nation's capital. Major newspapers ran bold headlines exposing the deep connections between government officials and the corporation's environmental crimes. The Washington Post's investigative team had uncovered emails, bank transfers, and meeting logs that painted a devastating picture of corruption reaching into the highest levels of government. Daniel sat at the breakfast table, spreading out 3 different newspapers while Judge Morris reviewed the coverage. The evidence was overwhelming. 3 cabinet members and dozens of senior officials had actively helped cover up the corporation's illegal activities. "Look at this," Judge Morris said, pointing to a detailed timeline. They knew about the toxic dumping for years. Within hours, the first resignation came from the Environmental Protection Agency's director. Her voice trembled as she read a carefully worded statement to the press, expressing deep regret while avoiding any direct admission of guilt. 2 deputy secretaries followed suit before lunch, and by dinner, 7 more officials had stepped down. Public outrage grew by the hour. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, their signs demanding justice and reform. Social media platforms overflowed with angry citizens calling for a complete overhaul of environmental regulations. The pressure became so intense that the president addressed the nation, announcing the formation of a special commission to investigate regulatory failures. Judge Morris was called to testify before Congress, and Daniel watched from the gallery as his guardian approached the podium. The system's failure wasn't accidental, Judge Morris declared to the packed chamber. It was systematically dismantled by the very people sworn to protect it. His voice carried authority as he outlined specific proposals for reform: independent oversight boards, strengthened whistleblower protections, and rigorous environmental impact reviews with real enforcement power. Committee members leaned forward in their seats, many taking notes as Judge Morris detailed the legislative changes needed. Some asked supportive questions, while others seemed defensive about their own oversight roles. Through it all, Judge Morris remained focused on the facts, backing each point with evidence from their recent case. That evening, Daniel sat in their living room watching the news coverage. The anchor's voice was grave as she declared it a watershed moment for environmental justice. The broadcast showed clips from the congressional hearing, crowds of protesters and resigned officials hurrying from their offices with boxes of personal items. When they showed a photograph of Daniel's parents at an environmental rally years ago, he felt tears well up in his eyes. Judge Morris placed a steady hand on his shoulder as they watched the news anchor detail the scope of the reforms being proposed. The story of Daniel's parents had become more than a personal tragedy. It had grown into a catalyst for national change. Daniel thought about his mother's secret identity, her fight from within the corporation, and his father's support of her mission. Their sacrifice had illuminated the path toward real corporate accountability and environmental protection. Though they were gone, their legacy lived on in the sweeping changes now reshaping the halls of power. The gentle lapping of water against the shore brought a sense of peace to Daniel as he sat on the weathered wooden bench by the lake. This had been his parents' special place. They'd spent countless Sunday afternoons here having picnics and sharing stories. Now the sparkling surface of the water seemed to hold memories in every ripple. In his weekly sessions with Dr. Hansen, Daniel had been learning to face these memories without being overwhelmed by grief. She taught him breathing exercises that helped calm his racing thoughts and ways to ground himself when anxiety threatened to take over. "Remember, Daniel," Dr. Hansen would say in her gentle voice, "healing isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to carry our memories with strength." During one particularly breakthrough session, Daniel shared how he'd discovered his mother's old art supplies in storage. Dr. Hansen encouraged him to try painting, suggesting it might help him process his emotions in a different way. At first, Daniel's hand shook as he held the brushes his mother once used. But gradually, with each stroke, he found himself getting lost in the colors and textures. Sometimes he painted abstract swirls of emotion, dark blues for his sadder days, bright yellows for moments of hope. Other times he tried to capture memories, the way his father's eyes crinkled when he laughed, or his mother's favorite flower garden. The lake became his favorite subject. Something about the way light played on water reminded him of how life kept moving forward, even through the darkest times. He spent hours trying to capture the perfect reflection of clouds on the surface, mixing colors until they matched exactly what he saw. One afternoon, as sunlight danced across the water, Daniel set up his easel by the bench. His strokes were more confident now, months of practice guiding his hand. He carefully blended the blues and silvers of the water, added touches of gold where sun met surface, and included the old bench where his parents used to sit. When the painting was complete, Daniel studied it thoughtfully. It wasn't just a scene. It was a story of his journey. The dark shadows under the trees represented his grief, while the brilliant spots of sunlight showed hope breaking through. He decided this painting belonged in his room, where it could remind him daily of both what he'd lost and how far he'd come. Dr. Hansen noted how painting had helped Daniel express feelings he struggled to put into words. "Art gives us another language," she explained during their sessions. "Sometimes our hearts need that different way of speaking." Through his art and therapy, Daniel was learning to hold both joy and sadness in his heart, to honor his parents' memory while building his own path forward. The lake remained his sanctuary, a place where past and present merged as peacefully as colors on his canvas. The morning sunlight streamed through the living room windows as Judge Morris, Eleanor, and Daniel sat together on the plush sofa, the official adoption papers spread before them on the coffee table. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he touched the crisp documents that would legally make him part of the Morris family. "Are you ready, son?" Judge Morris asked softly, placing a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. In the warmth of their home, surrounded by familiar photographs and the scent of Eleanor's fresh-baked cookies, the small gathering of close friends and family created an intimate atmosphere for the adoption ceremony. Judge Thompson, a longtime colleague of Judge Morris, officiated with gentle dignity. "We are here today," Judge Thompson began, "to celebrate the formal union of Daniel with the Morris family, though in their hearts, this bond has existed for some time." Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she watched Daniel stand before the small group. His voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the room as he spoke from his heart. "When I lost my parents, I thought I'd never feel whole again," Daniel said, his eyes bright with emotion. "But Judge Morris and Eleanor showed me that family isn't just about blood. They've given me a home, safety, and love when I needed it most." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My parents fought for what was right, especially protecting the environment. I want to continue their work, and I'm grateful to have a family who supports this dream." Judge Morris and Eleanor beamed with pride as Daniel continued, "Thank you for choosing me, for fighting for me, and for showing me that love can heal even the deepest wounds." After the formal signing of papers, the small group broke into applause. Eleanor pulled Daniel into a warm embrace, and Judge Morris wrapped his arms around them both. In that moment, surrounded by love and acceptance, Daniel felt the last pieces of his heart falling into place, knowing he truly belonged. A few weeks later, one afternoon across the newly landscaped community park, Daniel stood at the podium, his hands steady on the wooden surface. Judge Morris sat in the front row, offering an encouraging smile. The crowd of community members, environmental activists, and local families spread out before him on rows of white chairs. "Thank you all for being here today," Daniel began, his voice clear and strong. "This park represents more than just a green space in our community. It stands as a testament to my parents' dedication to protecting our environment and their unwavering pursuit of truth." As he spoke, memories of the past year's journey flickered through his mind. "When I lost my parents, I thought my world had ended. But through their legacy, I discovered a greater purpose. The files they protected, the truth they fought to reveal, led to changes that will protect countless families and preserve our environment for generations to come." The audience listened intently as Daniel shared stories of his parents' commitment to environmental justice. He spoke of their dream for clean air, pure water, and safe communities for all children. His words touched hearts and strengthened resolve, drawing nods and quiet tears from those gathered. "Today, we're not just dedicating a park," Daniel continued. "We're creating a living memorial to everyone who stands up for what's right, who fights for justice, and who believes in leaving the world better than they found it." Judge Morris watched proudly as Daniel stepped down from the podium to unveil the dedication plaque. Together, they pulled away the covering to reveal the bronze memorial, the Sarah and James Wheeler Memorial Park, where truth takes root. The ceremony moved to the center of the park, where Daniel and Judge Morris took up shovels for the ceremonial tree planting. The young oak tree, selected for its strength and longevity, represented new beginnings and deep roots in the community. As Daniel patted the soil around the sapling's base, community members came forward to add their own handfuls of earth, each contribution a promise to nurture both the tree and the values it represented. The park buzzed with activity as families explored the new paths, and children played on the eco-friendly equipment. Daniel walked alongside Judge Morris through the winding trails, taking in the sight of people enjoying this space that meant so much to them both. They paused by a butterfly garden, watching as several monarch butterflies danced among the native flowers. Environmental activists chatted with community members about upcoming conservation projects, while children gathered around a naturalist explaining the importance of pollinator species. "Your parents would be so proud," Judge Morris said softly, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel nodded, watching a young girl carefully water one of the newly planted flowers. The park had become more than just a memorial. It was a living, breathing symbol of hope and renewal, exactly as his parents would have wanted. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.